Sherlock Holmes and the Case of the Invisible Killer. Before we begin, tell us, where are you listening from tonight? It was on the bleak morning of March the 6th, 1892, that I first heard of the incident at Warwick Square. Holmes and I were in the breakfast room of our Baker Street lodgings, the windows steamed with condensation, the gaslight hissing faintly overhead. Holmes, in his dressing gown, was seated cross-legged upon the floor, immersed in the dissecting of a Turkish cigarette. A pastime he claimed allowed him to think more precisely. I had just poured my second cup of coffee when Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram, her face unusually pale. "A gentleman from the Home Office brought this himself," she said with quiet unease. Holmes accepted the note without comment, slit it with a letter opener, and read. His brows rose. Warwick Square. A banker found dead in a locked room. No wounds, no poison detected. Scotland Yard is baffled. He turned the telegram around and held it to the light, as if expecting it to reveal some hidden truth. "Most interesting," he murmured. "Would you care to accompany me, Watson? It seems the game is afoot." An hour later, we were in a cab cutting through the grey fog that clung to the Thames like a second skin. The city passed us by in fragments, sooty chimneys, clanging horse trams, the sour-faced newspaper boys shrieking the day's headlines. But even their cries held nothing of the strange news Holmes now pondered. "What do you make of it?" I asked. "No wounds, no poison," he repeated. "Yet the man is indisputably dead. The telegram omits whether it was cardiac failure or suffocation, which leads me to believe the cause was not apparent, even under medical inspection. That would suggest a very subtle form of murder, or a very clumsy one, so clumsy in fact that it circles back upon itself and appears masterful. We arrived at number 8, Warwick Square, a fine townhouse with iron railings and ivy creeping up the brick facade. A constable stood at the door. We were admitted promptly and led to the second floor, where Inspector Lestrade awaited us. He was a short man, wiry and impatient, with an expression that combined suspicion with fatigue. "I'm glad you came, Mr. Holmes," he said. "The whole affair's out of the ordinary, even by your standards." Holmes nodded curtly. "The victim?" "Mr. Edwin Greaves, 54, senior partner at Greaves, Morton and Langley, private bank in Lombard Street. Found dead at 5:30 this morning by his valet. In his study, doors locked from the inside, windows latched. No signs of violence, no smell of gas, and the doctor says there's not a mark on the body." We were shown into the study. It was a handsome room, tastefully furnished, its walls lined with legal volumes and ledgers. A fire had died to embers in the grate. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn shut, but Lestrade parted them to allow in some filtered light. Greaves lay sprawled on a chaise lounge near the hearth. His skin was ashen, but there were no signs of trauma, no blood, no bruising, no contortion of agony. His limbs rested as if in sleep. The only unnatural thing was his eyes wide open and glassy, staring upwards at the ceiling. Holmes leaned over him, inspecting without touching. "Any drinks or food taken last night?" "His usual brandy," said Lestrade. "Untouched. So's the cigar box." Holmes sniffed at the decanter, then peered into the glass. "No residue, no scent but brandy." "What about papers?" "Nothing missing. Desk drawers locked. Key was in his pocket." Holmes turned to the window. It was sealed, the sash dusty at the edges. "Any other entry point?" "None. Only one door, one window. No servants heard anything, and the hallway carpet is thick, no sounds of movement." Holmes crouched and examined the skirting boards and the window latch. Then he turned his attention to a low brass vent near the fireplace. "Aha," he said. "This vent, where does it lead?" "The flue, I suppose. Or possibly into the next room." Holmes produced a measuring tape from his coat pocket and began taking rapid measurements between the vent and the study walls, muttering numbers. I stood baffled, watching him. Then he snapped the tape shut and straightened up. "Has the body been moved?" "No." "Then let us keep it so for now." I shall require a moment alone, Inspector. Watson, if you would remain with me. Lestrade gave a begrudging nod and stepped out. Holmes closed the door, then moved to the bookshelf. He pulled out volume after volume, flipping through pages, scanning margins, examining spines. At last he stopped and withdrew a thin black volume titled Foreign Chemical Patents, 1889. Curious, he said. Greaves was a banker, yet this book is wholly unrelated to finance. Perhaps an idle interest. Perhaps, or perhaps the key to his demise. I must confess, I saw nothing in the book to support this, but Holmes pocketed it. You believe the killer never entered the room? I asked. I believe the killer was never in it at all, Holmes replied cryptically, but that would make it, yes, invisible. He smiled faintly. Come, Watson. I believe we must now interview the man who found the body. We descended to the servants' quarters, where the valet, a neat fellow named Simmons, awaited us. He was composed but pale, and his eyes darted nervously toward the stairwell. I found him at his usual hour, Simmons said. 5:30. He's always awake by then, sir, always reading. Did anything strike you as unusual in the room? No, sir. Nothing moved or misplaced. But, he hesitated. Yes? There was a smell, not strong, but odd, like wet rope, or mold. Holmes's eyes lit up. Mold? Yes, sir, but not from the fireplace. I checked. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Very good, Simmons. That will be all for now. Back in the cab, Holmes was unusually quiet. He toyed with his cane, tapping it against his boot. Watson, he said at length, if I am right, and I believe I am, we are dealing not merely with a murder, but with a method so refined, so esoteric, that its very elegance masks it from the senses. In a manner of speaking, but not of the ingestible kind. This is no ordinary crime. This is the work of an intellect, an artist in death. And the motive? Unknown. But I intend to find it. As we rattled back toward Baker Street through the fog, I felt the same tingle in my spine I always did at the beginning of Holmes's strangest adventures, the moment when the impossible seemed to beckon, and only one man could bring it to heel. We arrived at Baker Street just as the fog began to lift, but the atmosphere inside our lodgings remained dense with thought. Holmes paced slowly, hands clasped behind his back, his brow deeply furrowed. I knew this posture well. It meant the puzzle had acquired a particularly stubborn piece. The book retrieved from Greaves' study lay unopened on the table. Beside it, Holmes had placed a sheet of foolscap and was jotting down notes in a coded shorthand I had long since ceased trying to interpret. Watson, he said suddenly, halting near the fireplace. Do you recall Simmons' observation? The smell, I replied. Yes, he described it as mold or wet rope. Holmes nodded. There are odors that reveal much, my friend. We dismiss them because they lack definition, but the olfactory sense, once trained, can be every bit as instructive as the eye. He turned and opened the black book. The pages were filled with entries describing obscure patents, chemical processes, synthetic compounds, industrial byproducts. He stopped at a marked page and tapped the text with a long, pale finger. Here, a German patent from Dresden, 1889. A compound used to preserve parchment and museum specimens. Chloride of mercury in vaporized form, nearly undetectable, save for a faint, musty odor not unlike. Wet rope, I finished. Exactly. He turned to me, eyes gleaming. Mercuric chloride vapor is fatal when inhaled in sufficient quantities. It causes respiratory paralysis, but leaves no external signs. In its diluted form, it is used in antiseptics, but in the hands of someone who understands how to release it in gaseous form, in a closed room, it could kill silently and vanish without trace. But how would such a vapor be introduced without the victim suspecting something? That, Watson, is the detail I intend to uncover. Just then, a rap sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson appeared a moment later with a card on her tray. "A Mr. Clive Mortimer to see you, sir." "Ah," said Holmes, "the junior partner in Mr. Greaves' firm. Show him in." A well-dressed gentleman in his 30s entered, removing his gloves as he glanced nervously about the room. His face bore the pallor of recent shock, but his voice was composed. "Mr. Holmes, I hope I'm not intruding. I've just come from Scotland Yard. They mentioned you were involved." "Indeed, Mr. Mortimer." "Please, sit. I assume you've come regarding your late associate?" Mortimer nodded. "We are all stunned, sir. Edwin Greaves was the foundation of our firm, reliable to a fault, never ill, never absent. Had he any enemies? None that I know of. Though I suppose in banking, one always makes a few, but nothing personal, no threats, no lawsuits. Was he under any strain lately? Financial pressure? Blackmail?" "None that I'm aware of," Mortimer said carefully. "But now that you mention it, there was something odd. About a week ago, he asked me to investigate a transaction that had passed through our accounts, a foreign remittance, significant but legal. Still, he was unsettled. Said it bore the hallmarks of something illicit. Do you recall the source? A firm in Belgium, a shipping outfit. I have the documents, if you'd like. Please deliver them to Baker Street by this evening." After Mortimer's departure, Holmes returned to the open volume. "Belgium. Interesting. That aligns with a case I encountered last year involving smuggled industrial toxins routed through Antwerp. Watson, we may be looking at an operation much broader than mere murder. But why would Greaves be targeted? Perhaps he knew too much. Or perhaps he was merely a means to an end." Later that afternoon, we returned to Warwick Square to conduct a more thorough inspection of the study. Lestrade, ever the pragmatist, had lost interest after the post-mortem failed to reveal any visible cause of death. But Holmes was now alight with purpose. The first point of examination was the fireplace vent. Holmes removed his gloves and ran his fingers along the inside edge of the grill. "Feel this, Watson," he said. The metal was oddly oily, and there was a faint residue, almost sticky to the touch. "Chemical discharge," Holmes confirmed. "Not from coal soot, and this residue is recent." He stood and examined the flue mechanism. No sign of tampering from the chimney, which leads me to believe the vapor was introduced internally from within the house. But how? Through the fireplace? Perhaps, Holmes mused, or more likely, through an object near it. He turned his attention to a small bronze statuette on the mantel, a rearing horse cast in exquisite detail. "This is hollow," he muttered. "And the base unscrews." With careful fingers, he detached the base. Inside was a thin glass vial, shattered. A dry, powdery substance clung to the interior. Holmes sniffed it cautiously, then sealed the base again. "A delivery device," he said. "Ingenious. The statue is designed to release vapor when exposed to heat. When the fire was lit, the powder converted to gas and filled the room. It's timed to coincide with Greaves' nightly routine, his brandy, his reading chair, and a closed room. He would never suspect it." "And the culprit simply had to wait?" "Yes," Holmes said grimly. "Wait for him to inhale his death, then collect their reward, likely financial." Holmes spent another hour cataloguing items in the room. Several papers were removed, and we secured the statuette in a sealed box for later testing. Before leaving, Holmes asked to speak with the housekeeper, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Penlay. "Who has access to this study besides Mr. Greaves?" "No one, sir. Only Mr. Simmons would enter, and even then, not often. Has anything been moved or cleaned since the discovery?" "No, sir. We left it just as the inspector asked." "Very good. Tell me, who arranged the decor in this room?" "Mostly Mr. Greaves. Though that statuette on the mantel, he received that as a gift just last week." "Indeed. From whom?" "I don't rightly recall. It came by post. No return address. Holmes gave me a quick glance. And did he mention it? Only that it was finely made and that he thought it might be French. Outside, as we crossed the square toward our cab, Holmes lit a cigarette with sharp precision. "Watson, the killer has made one misstep an anonymous gift. Even the cleverest criminal cannot account for human sentiment. Greaves kept the object not because of suspicion, but admiration. That admiration may prove their undoing." "Do you think the statuette came from Belgium as well?" "Possibly. But more likely it was routed from somewhere else entirely, through Belgium as a blind." Back at Baker Street, a parcel was waiting on our table, the banking documents promised by Mortimer. Holmes slit the string and spread them out. "Look here," he said. "Several transfers from an entity called Société Ardente routed through Antwerp. One, 3 weeks ago, then another, just 5 days before Greaves's death. What's their significance?" "That," Holmes said, "is what I intend to find out." And with that, he rang the bell for a messenger. "To the Foreign Office," he said, "and ask them to send me everything they have on the Société Ardente." The clues were aligning, but the shadow behind them had not yet stepped into the light. Somewhere between the pages of banking ledgers and the toxic core of a bronze horse, the invisible killer waited to be seen. 2 days passed before the Foreign Office responded to Holmes' request, and during that interval, his restlessness became near manic. He declined 2 routine client meetings, refused meals, and spent hours at his chemistry table, reducing the powdered residue from the statuette to a vaporized sample for testing. The room was thick with the smells of acids and burning compounds. I made myself useful by reading up on international shipping companies, though I knew Holmes regarded such efforts with polite indulgence. At last, on the 3rd morning, a courier delivered a sealed envelope marked "Confidential" for S.H. in bold, red ink. Holmes opened it with impatient fingers and read quickly. His face remained unreadable as he lowered the papers. "Société Ardente," he said, "is a front." "For whom?" I asked. "Unclear, but it is nominally based in Antwerp and has no physical office. It appears to exist solely for the transfer of funds between anonymous shell entities in Belgium, Switzerland, and most notably London." He tossed the papers across to me. "There's your misdirection, Watson. Everything about it is designed to seem legal, yet it lacks substance. Greaves must have discovered this discrepancy and raised concerns internally." "Which makes motive plain," I said. "If someone stood to lose everything by that exposure." "Precisely." Holmes moved toward the fireplace and stood there a moment, lost in thought. "And now," he said briskly, "we must pay a visit to the firm itself." We hailed a cab to Lombard Street. The banking house of Greaves, Morton, and Langley stood as a narrow stone building, its doorway framed by polished brass rails and a discreet nameplate. Inside, all was as one might expect of a respectable financial institution: ticking clocks, the quiet rustle of ledgers, and clerks moving like clockwork gears. We were received by Mr. Langley, the 3rd partner, who had taken over day-to-day operations since Greaves' death. Langley was a portly man with florid cheeks and a voice that suggested he had long grown comfortable behind layers of bureaucracy. "I'm not sure what I can add, Mr. Holmes," he said as we were seated in a dark paneled office. "We are all in mourning. Edwin was not merely a partner, he was the very spine of our enterprise." "Were you aware of his concern over recent transactions?" Holmes asked. Langley blinked. "Transactions?" "Yes. The ones routed through Société Ardente." Langley stiffened. "I don't manage the overseas accounts directly. That was Greaves' area. But surely he must have consulted you if he believed something illicit was occurring." I cannot say," Langley replied, but there was a crack in his tone. Holmes leaned forward. "And yet your junior partner, Mr. Mortimer, knew of it. Why didn't you?" "I suppose Greaves didn't think it urgent. Or perhaps," Holmes said coolly, "he didn't trust you." Langley flushed, then rose from his chair. I must insist, sir, that you tread carefully. This firm's reputation is not to be trifled with. Holmes remained seated. Quite so. 1. Last question. Were you aware that Greaves received a bronze statuette by post shortly before his death? Langley hesitated. No. Should I have been? Holmes offered a thin smile. Not necessarily. Good day, Mr. Langley. Back outside. Holmes hailed another cab, but gave no destination. Instead, he sat with eyes closed, tapping the cane against his boot. Langley knows more than he's admitting, he said. Did you see the ledger behind his desk? Open to a page dated last week. He was reviewing it before we entered. You think he's involved? I think he fears something, Holmes replied. But fear does not equate to guilt. Not yet. That afternoon brought a surprise visitor. Mrs. Agnes Greaves, the widow, arrived at Baker Street unannounced. She was a tall, elegant woman of about 50, impeccably dressed, and with a quiet dignity that immediately won my sympathy. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, she said as Holmes stood to greet her. But I heard you were investigating my husband's death. We are, madam, Holmes replied gently, and we are making progress. I don't wish to interfere, she said, folding her gloves. But there is something I must show you. She removed a folded letter from her handbag. This was in Edwin's private drawer. It was addressed to me, but only to be opened if anything happened to him. Holmes read the letter in silence, then passed it to me. It was written in a strong but hurried hand. Agnes, if anything unnatural happens to me, tell Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I have discovered something within the firm, something connected to our Antwerp accounts. I fear I may have angered someone powerful. If this letter finds you, I pray it is not too late. Edwin. Holmes handed the letter back with a grave expression. Thank you, Mrs. Greaves. You've just confirmed my theory that your husband feared for his life, but didn't know where the danger would come from. She looked down. I didn't want to believe it. He had enemies in business, yes, but murder? Not all murderers come with knives or pistols, Mrs. Greaves. Some use money, position, and chemistry. After she left, Holmes returned to his chemistry table and examined the residue from the statue once more. Watson, I believe the design of the statue is as important as its content. Bronze, thin, deliberate craftsmanship. It was made not only to contain the vapor, but to delay its release. You think someone commissioned it? Yes, and not just anyone. An artisan, or someone with enough capital to commission fine work in secret. As evening fell, we received another visitor this time. A young man with ink-stained cuffs and nervous energy. He introduced himself as Harold Wykes, a junior clerk at the bank. I know I'm not supposed to speak out of turn, he said in a hush, but I saw something last week. Mr. Greaves had a heated argument with Mr. Langley. It was in the hallway, late after most had gone. What was said? I couldn't hear much, but Greaves shouted something about laundering blood money. Langley told him to keep out of what he didn't understand. Then they saw me and stopped talking. Holmes leaned forward. Did Mr. Greaves mention it afterward? No, but he looked troubled for days after. I think he suspected something rotten, sir. Thank you, Mr. Wykes. You've been very helpful. After the clerk left, Holmes stood silently by the fire. Watson, he said, we now have 3 threads. Greaves' discovery, the vaporized poison, and the financial trail. They are converging, but one piece remains elusive, the means by which the statuette reached his study. For that, we must speak to the person who handles the post. The next morning, we returned to Warwick Square. Simmons, the valet, directed us to a footman named Griggs, who handled all deliveries. The statue, he said when we asked. Yes, I remember. Arrived in a wooden crate, wrapped in straw. Came with a small note, a token of esteem. No name, no signature. Do you recall the postmark? Southampton, I think. Or Portsmouth. Holmes's face sharpened. Port cities. Of course. Back at Baker Street, Holmes tore open his railway timetable. "Pack a bag, Watson," he said. "We leave for Portsmouth this evening. I believe we'll find our artist there, the man who forged the invisible weapon. If we find him, we find our killer." We departed for Portsmouth on the 6 o'clock train, the March wind clawing at the windows as the countryside blurred past in greys and greens. Holmes remained silent for most of the journey, his eyes fixed on the shifting horizon beyond the glass. He had brought with him a copy of the London Directory of Artisans and Tradesmen, which he skimmed only once before slipping it into his coat pocket. "This statuette was not a factory piece," he said finally, breaking his long silence. "It was handcrafted bespoke, which means it passed through hands, Watson. Human hands. And human hands leave trails." We arrived in Portsmouth shortly after 8 and checked into the modest station hotel. The town, with its docks and narrow alleys, smelled of salt and machinery. Holmes wasted no time. He insisted we walk to the artisan quarter, a web of old streets nestled between the harbour and a crumbling set of warehouses. Using the address he'd marked in the directory, we arrived at a cramped workshop identified by a small hanging sign. Thurley Bronzes, custom metalwork. Since 1862. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of oil and scorched metal. A man in his 50s, with a scorched leather apron and weathered hands, looked up as we entered. "Mr. Amos Thurley?" Holmes inquired. "I am," the man replied, wiping his palms. "And you?" "My name is Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. We're investigating a certain piece. You may have produced a bronze statuette in the form of a rearing horse, approximately 8 inches in height." Thurley squinted at Holmes. "I make a fair few statues, Mr. Holmes." Holmes drew a folded sketch from his coat, an exact likeness he had prepared before leaving Baker Street, and laid it on the counter. "This one," he said. Thurley studied the sketch carefully. "Yes, that's my work." "No doubt. I did that piece a fortnight ago. Special request. Precision cavity inside the body. Sealed base. Fine detailing." "Do you recall the buyer?" Holmes asked. "Of course. It was commissioned by a man named Vellum. Strange name, that. Said he was buying a gift for an old schoolmaster. Paid in cash. Wanted it delivered to a forwarding address, some warehouse up by the Portsmouth docks." Holmes's face showed no reaction, but I could sense his satisfaction. "Did he mention what the cavity was for?" "Keepsake compartment," he said. "Wanted it heat-resistant, too. I thought it odd who heats a bronze statue. But the money was good. Did he leave any personal details?" "No, but he had an accent. Eastern European. Not heavy, just enough to notice. And he wore gloves. Indoors." "Thank you, Mr. Thurley. You've been most helpful." As we stepped back into the night air, Holmes paused by a lamppost and lit a cigarette. "Vellum," he said. "A pseudonym, obviously. And the forwarding address may be our next destination." He hailed a cab and directed it to the Northern Wharf district. We arrived at a derelict-looking warehouse, marked only with the number 47. Holmes knocked sharply on the iron door. No answer. "Locked," he said after trying the handle. "And no lights. We'll come back tomorrow." We returned first thing the next morning. But the warehouse had been cleared. The dust was undisturbed, the crates gone, the floor swept. Holmes examined the space with narrowed eyes. "There were recent occupants," he said, "but they've flown, and quickly." He stooped by a dark stain near the far wall, touched it, sniffed. Oil. Machine grade. Not lamp. Someone operated equipment here recently, perhaps for chemical handling. I followed Holmes as he paced the perimeter of the warehouse. Near the back, he found a discarded envelope stamped with a red wax seal. Inside was a single folded sheet of thick paper. "Watson," he murmured, "read this. Delivery received. Activation confirmed. Target will be compromised on schedule. No further contact." Holmes folded the note and slipped it into his breast pocket. "We are dealing with a conspiracy of design, Watson. one that kills with elegance, distance, and silence. We took the afternoon train back to London, both of us subdued. As we disembarked, Holmes gave a low sigh. I had hoped to catch the maker's hand in motion, but we've found the brushstrokes, at least. Back at Baker Street, Lestrade was waiting. He had brought 2 new developments. First, the autopsy results were in, though still inconclusive. No visible trauma, no chemical traces in the blood. Death from respiratory failure remained the best explanation. The second was more alarming. There's been a second death, Lestrade announced grimly. Under nearly identical circumstances. Holmes stiffened. Where? South Kensington. A Miss Lydia Farnsworth, elderly spinster, found dead in her parlor chair. No wounds, no signs of struggle. Room locked from inside. Holmes sprang into action. We must go. At once. The residence was a genteel brick house on a quiet crescent. We were let in by a trembling housemaid. Miss Farnsworth's body remained untouched in the parlor, awaiting the coroner. She sat slumped in an armchair, her posture eerily similar to that of Edwin Greaves. Holmes took one glance and moved to the mantelpiece. There, in pride of place, stood a bronze sculpture this time, a cat, arched and lifelike. He examined its base. Hollow, he said. Same design, same mechanism. Lestrade whistled. Another poisoned ornament? Holmes nodded. And another invisible killer. As he examined the room, his eyes landed on a framed letter beside the sculpture. He picked it up and read aloud. Dearest Lydia, accept this gift as a token of gratitude for your years of guidance. You always believed in me. Warm regards, a former pupil. No signature, Holmes muttered. No address. He turned to Lestrade. Have the letter and statue seized and brought to my lab. No one touches them without gloves. Outside, Holmes walked swiftly. Watson. This second case confirms everything. The killer is testing a delivery system refined, contained, and deadly. But there is a flaw in their brilliance. What flaw? Emotion. In both instances, the message that accompanied the murder weapon was personal. Faux personal, to be sure, but the killer cannot help themselves. There is vanity in this. And what of the victims? What connects them? That, Holmes said, is the thread we must now follow. Both were solitary, both of modest influence, but both, I suspect, knew something. Back at Baker Street, Holmes requested I make inquiries into Miss Farnsworth's past. I visited her parish, and the local librarian confirmed that she had once worked as a private tutor. Not just any tutor, she had taught languages to foreign diplomats' children during the 1,860 seconds and 1,870 seconds. When I relayed this to Holmes, he went still. Watson, he said, do you see it? She was connected to foreign figures, Greaves to foreign funds. Precisely. They were both unwitting links in a chain. Someone is cleaning up, removing the weakest, most distant connections. A ghost, sweeping its own tracks. Then who's next? That, Holmes said, eyes glinting. We must discover before they, too, receive a gift. The following morning brought with it a sense of unease neither Holmes nor I could shake. The death of Lydia Farnsworth had thrown the case into a darker frame. This was no longer the silencing of a single banker privy to financial irregularities. It was, as Holmes had begun to say more frequently, a pattern of executions, quiet, cold, and deliberate. Holmes stood by the window in our sitting room, staring into the thin grey mist over Baker Street. In one hand, he held a page torn from a notebook. With the other, he tapped it lightly against his knuckles. On the table before him lay an open copy of Burke's Peerage and a small pile of correspondence we had yet to examine. It had become his habit to cross-reference nearly every known associate of both Edwin Greaves and Lydia Farnsworth. Watson, he said suddenly, if I were to kill without leaving a trace, I would ensure the victims had no visible connection, no shared history, no recent correspondence. And yet these two do share something, I finished for him. An indirect tie to foreign dealings. Exactly. He stepped away from the window and turned over the page in his hand. This is a list of names Miss Farnsworth kept in her correspondence drawer. Students, mostly. I've circled one. I took the paper. Alphonse Ducharme. Yes, he studied French and German with her in the 1,870 seconds, then disappeared from public records. Until 5 years ago, when he re-emerged as a chemical consultant for a Belgian shipping syndicate. Société Ardente. The same entity tied to Greaves' financial transfers. Holmes gave a tight nod. Ducharme is the bridge. He was likely the designer of the vapor compound, or its original procurer. Either way, he ties both victims to the mechanism of their deaths. At that moment, Mrs. Hudson appeared with an envelope. "Telegram, sir." Holmes read it, then passed it to me. From Inspector Lestrade, third suspicious death reported male, 62, found in Regent's Park residence. Circumstances identical. Request your presence immediately. Without another word, Holmes was already retrieving his coat. The residence in Regent's Park belonged to one Mr. Elias Coburn, a retired solicitor. We arrived to find Lestrade in the drawing room, pale and visibly disturbed. The body had been removed, but the scene remained preserved almost theatrically pristine. The chair was angled toward the fire, the tea untouched on the side table. Most significantly, on the mantel above the hearth, stood a bronze sculpture, a seated dog this time, regal and finely polished. Holmes examined it quickly, lifting it with his gloved hands. Hollow. Matching mechanism. Our artist's work again. Lestrade exhaled. That's 3, Holmes. No signs of violence. 3 locked-room deaths in 2 weeks. The press will get wind of this soon. We'll have panic in Mayfair. Not if we stop the next one, Holmes said flatly. I walked toward a small shelf containing legal volumes and personal papers. Holmes, look at this. I pointed to a marked folder. Inside were documents related to a civil case, Ducharme versus the Belgian Maritime Council. Holmes skimmed the papers rapidly. Coburn represented a whistleblower against Ducharme's consortium. He knew something damaging, likely held documentation of the toxins routed through Antwerp. That makes 3 victims who either challenged or uncovered fragments of the same operation. He turned to Lestrade. We need a list of everyone connected to Ducharme's dealings, students, partners, opponents, anyone who may possess knowledge of the operation. We're hunting a man, erasing his past. Lestrade grimaced. We're already stretched thin. You're saying there could be more targets? Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to the sculpture and sniffed the base. Trace of chemical vapor, faint but present. We must move faster. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes disappeared into his bedroom for several hours. When he emerged, he was no longer Sherlock Holmes, the gentleman detective, but a stooped, bearded figure with worn boots and soot-stained cuffs. Holmes, I exclaimed. He waved me off. I must become someone else tonight, Watson. Someone who frequents the docks, listens without attracting attention, and asks questions about bronze shipments, foreign chemists, and sealed crates. Shall I come with you? No. Your presence would draw notice. Stay and compile every known detail about Ducharme. Cross-check every Belgian chemical import over the last year. Look for omissions or unexplained arrivals. Time is the one thing we haven't enough of. And with that, he was gone. It was well past midnight when he returned, weary but alert. Well? I asked, rising from my desk. He pulled off the disguise, tossing the beard onto the floor. I spoke to a stoker who moves freight for a discreet shipping outfit out of Dover. 2 days ago, they sent off a sealed crate to an address in Marylebone, matching the size and weight of the previous statues. Another weapon? Almost certainly. And I now know the destination. He handed me a slip of paper. Lady Helena Durbridge, widowed philanthropist, former ambassador's wife, runs an educational trust for foreign students. Another connection. Yes. Ducharme once applied to her trust for funding, rejected. She may know more than she realizes. We were at Lady Durbridge's townhouse by 9 the next morning. A smartly dressed butler led us into a bright drawing room, where the lady herself, sharp-eyed and resolute despite her advanced years, greeted us with some surprise. "Mr. Holmes, you must forgive the early hour. We come bearing urgency, Lady Durbridge. May we ask, have you received any unusual packages recently?" She frowned. As a matter of fact, yes. Just yesterday. A gift, apparently. A bronze sculpture. Quite charming. A fox, I believe. Where is it now? In the study. Holmes turned sharply. "Do not enter that room, Lady Durbridge." "May I?" She looked taken aback but gestured permission. Holmes strode into the study, returning moments later with the sculpture swaddled in a cloth. "It is as I feared," he said grimly. "The delivery was timed for a quiet morning at home. You were intended to be the next victim." Lady Durbridge paled. "But why me? You crossed paths with a man who considers even mild interference an unforgivable betrayal. You are fortunate, madam. Today, death knocked gently." We left the house in silence, the sculpture secured in Holmes's satchel. As we climbed back into our cab, Holmes finally spoke. "This confirms it. The killer has a list and is working through it, eliminating loose ends. But now he's begun to accelerate. The risk is greater, but so is his desperation. Do you think he knows you're pursuing him?" "Oh, I'm sure of it," Holmes said with a thin smile. "And I intend to make that fact undeniable." Back at Baker Street, Holmes set the sculpture on the table beside the others. 3 finely wrought death machines, silent, gleaming, innocuous. "Watson," he said, his voice low, "there is something missing. A 4th piece. One that ties these together. A clue buried in elegance." I watched as he opened the base of each statue again, this time measuring with minute precision the depth of the internal cavity. "See here," he whispered. "Each cavity is identical in volume but different in temperature tolerance. Greaves's sculpture melted at a lower fire. Coburn's needed more heat. This one activates at mere candle warmth." "The killer is adapting," I said. Holmes looked at me, gravely. "Yes, Watson. And that's what frightens me. The invisible killer is learning, but so am I." The following 24 hours marked a turning point in the case, not through any single revelation, but through the growing weight of its implications. 3 lives had been claimed, a 4th had nearly joined them, and somewhere in the maze of identities, false trails, and polished bronze, the man Holmes had taken to calling the ghost chemist was still out of reach. Holmes rarely sat now. He paced, wrote, spoke in clipped phrases. Sleep eluded him. Even the violin lay untouched in its corner. It was late in the afternoon when a knock came at the door. A wiry young constable from Scotland Yard delivered a sealed envelope to Holmes. Inside was a cable from Lestrade, brief but urgent. "Unusual delivery intercepted at Euston Station, addressed to recipient in Bayswater. Matches description of previous sculptures. Contents seized. Recipient unaware. Suspect remains at large." Holmes tapped the telegram against his chin. Bayswater. A change in district. They're shifting patterns again. "Do you believe it's to avoid detection?" "Possibly. Or to disguise the selection criteria. But the killer is growing bolder. Interception means risk. Yet he sends another package within days of the last. He either believes we can't catch him or wants us to try." "What was the intended destination?" I asked. "Miss Julia Trengrove," Holmes replied. "Spinster. 46. Former secretary to a now defunct Anglo-Belgian political delegation. Once employed in the same orbit as Coburn." "The 4th link?" "Yes. And nearly the 4th body." He grabbed his coat. "We must speak with her immediately." Miss Trengrove lived in a modest terrace house on Talbot Road. She answered the door herself, pale, composed and clearly puzzled by our unannounced visit. "I'm sorry," she said cautiously. "But who are you?" Holmes introduced himself swiftly and explained the reason for our urgency. She frowned, ushering us in, and led us to a quiet parlor. "I haven't received any strange parcels," she said. "I've barely left the house this week." "You were sent one," Holmes said. "It was intercepted by Scotland Yard before delivery. A bronze statue containing a lethal vapor." Her face went white. "That's impossible." "I assure you, it is not." She sat heavily on the edge of a worn sofa. "But why would anyone want to harm me?" "You worked for a diplomatic committee in 1885, Holmes said. "Your work brought you in contact with correspondence tied to foreign shipments, am I correct?" "Yes," she replied slowly. "Mostly logistics. I filed paperwork and transcribed reports. There were hundreds of names, some Belgian firms, one or two German. Did one of them belong to Alphonse Ducharme?" Her brow furrowed. "Yes. He sent several memoranda. He was deeply involved in the petroleum contracts. But that was decades ago. I haven't spoken his name since." Holmes stood. "Miss Trengrove, you must leave this house tonight. Stay with a friend, a relative, anyone. You are being hunted by someone who is erasing everyone connected to a trail of evidence." "But Holmes raised a hand. "No argument. If he fails to kill you once, he will try again. Only the fact that the police intervened prevented your death this week." As we escorted her to a nearby cousin's residence, Holmes remained tightly wound, speaking little. Once she was safe, we returned to Baker Street, where Lestrade was waiting with a sealed crate on the floor between his boots. "This is it. The intercepted package. Just came back from chemical testing." Holmes knelt beside it, pried open the crate with a knife, and withdrew the latest sculpture this time, a raven perched on a stack of books. Beautiful, balanced, and unmistakably deadly. He removed the base. The internal vial had not yet shattered. "Untouched," he said. "It hadn't activated yet." Lestrade crossed his arms. "The customs office confirmed it came through Southampton, routed from the same forwarding address as the others." "Ducharme's network," Holmes murmured. Lestrade leaned in. "And there's more." We searched the workshop in Portsmouth again. Thurley's place. He's gone. Vanished without a trace. Door wide open. Tools left mid-use. Holmes's jaw clenched. He was silenced. Or fled. Unlikely. A man like Thurley does not run. He was paid to make these devices. But he didn't know their true purpose until he did, and then someone made sure he wouldn't speak. Holmes rose and strode to his desk. He pulled a sheaf of documents from a drawer, names, dates, connections, and laid them out across the table. "Watson, look at this pattern." There were 4 columns: name, connection to Ducharme, year of last known contact, and status. Greaves, Farnsworth, Coburn dead, Durbridge and Trengrove targeted. A red line connected them all. "He's eliminating indirect witnesses, Watson. But he's working backward, from the most recent contacts to the oldest. And there's a name missing." "Whose?" Holmes pointed to the list. "Colonel Ambrose Pennington, retired military attaché. Oversaw procurement during the Anglo-Belgian exchange in 1884. One of the original signatories on the Ducharme contract. Has he been targeted?" "Not yet, but he will be. He lives alone in Kensington. If we're to prevent another death, we must reach him first." We were in a cab within 5 minutes, racing through the twilight streets toward Kensington. The address was an ivy-draped row house at the edge of a quiet square. A butler answered the door with practiced courtesy, but his eyes narrowed as soon as Holmes introduced himself. "I'm sorry," he said. "The colonel is not receiving visitors." "Your employer is in danger. Let us in immediately." Whether it was the tone or the urgency in Holmes's voice, the butler relented and led us to the drawing room. Colonel Pennington was a wiry, steel-haired man with the bearing of a man still comfortable in a uniform. He rose with suspicion as we entered. "I say, what's the meaning of this?" "Colonel," Holmes said briskly, "you are being targeted by an assassin who has already killed 3 people. Their deaths were arranged to appear natural. You are next." Pennington's jaw tightened. "This is outrageous." Holmes stepped to the mantel. "Have you received any packages recently? A sculpture? A gift?" "No. He paused. "There was something," he admitted, "just this morning. A small parcel. Bronze elephant. No note. I left it in the study." Holmes dashed into the adjacent room. A moment later he returned, the sculpture wrapped in a towel. "It's sealed. It hasn't activated yet. Thank God." Pennington looked stunned. "But who would want me dead?" "Someone tying up the past," Holmes said. "You once approved a transaction that allowed dangerous chemicals to pass through British ports. You may not remember it, but someone else does. And that someone believes you could still expose him." Lestrade stepped forward. "We'll assign protection and confiscate the statue for examination." Holmes nodded. "Keep all windows open tonight. Ventilation is your ally." As we stepped outside, the cold night air seemed to strike Holmes with a burst of clarity. He stopped on the pavement, turned to me, and said quietly, "We now have every piece but one." "Which?" "The killer's identity. Is it not Ducharme?" "No. Ducharme is the architect, but he's not the hand that posts the statues. Someone else is executing the plan. Someone in London. Someone blending in." Holmes looked down the silent Kensington street and said, almost to himself, "He is here, watching. I've felt it since the second death. He knows my steps, which means it is time to show him that I know his." That night, Sherlock Holmes did not sleep, nor did he pace or speak. He sat, utterly still, in his armchair before the fire at Baker Street. His steepled fingers pressed lightly against his lips, eyes narrowed in calculation. I did not interrupt him. Something in his silence was charged electric with thought, a mental coil winding tighter with every tick of the mantel clock. At precisely 3 in the morning, he stirred. He stood slowly, as if every movement had to align with some internal schedule only he understood. Then he reached for a small lacquered box and opened it. Inside was an envelope marked in his own handwriting. Contingency. Class 3. I recognized the meaning immediately. Holmes rarely deployed contingency plans unless the matter threatened to spiral beyond traditional logic. That he now considered the case worthy of such a label made my pulse quicken. "Watson," he said softly, "we are no longer pursuing a man. We are playing against one." He opened the envelope and withdrew a folded page. On it were names, addresses, and coded instructions I could not decipher. He handed me a second envelope. "This is for Lestrade. It contains orders he will not understand but must follow. I'll explain when he arrives." And arrive he did shortly before dawn, summoned by a runner Holmes had dispatched an hour earlier. Lestrade entered looking groggy but alert, clearly having dressed in haste. "You said it was urgent," he muttered. Holmes passed him the envelope. "Follow it exactly. No deviation. Begin with the address in Paddington and proceed through the list. Do not inform your superiors. This is a private operation." Lestrade scowled but opened the page. His eyes scanned the contents, then widened. "These are warehouses, foreign mail offices, blacksmiths, and one printing press," Holmes added. "Each location was used to funnel the killer's tools. Our man is clever. He routes pieces of his work through unrelated facilities, making detection almost impossible. But in doing so, he repeats certain habits, vendors, hours, even postal clerks. That creates a pattern." Lestrade scratched his head. "And I'm to do what, exactly?" "Ask no questions. Simply observe who visits each location today. Record anyone matching this description." Holmes handed him a composite sketch, a thin man, early 40s, sharp nose, high cheekbones, with spectacles and a receding hairline. I compiled it from witness accounts, Thurley's apprentice, a postman, and the constable who handled the Bayswater parcel. Lestrade sighed. I'll do what I can. When he departed, Holmes turned to me. And now, Watson, it's our turn. We shall go to the heart of the operation. Where? The Belgian consulate. He gave no further explanation until we were seated in a hansom cab rolling briskly through Marylebone. Duchamp's activity began with the Société Ardent, he said, but every communication, every parcel, passed through consular protection. Immunity. No customs searches. No questions asked. Someone inside that building is shielding him. You believe Duchamp is in London? No, Holmes said, but I believe his executor is, and that man walks daily through the doors of the consulate without fear. The Belgian consulate was a dignified structure tucked between two embassies, its entrance flanked by two marble lions. Holmes showed his credentials and asked to see the consular secretary, one Monsieur Paul Heck. We were led into a high-ceilinged room lined with tall windows and foreign newspapers. Heck, a thin, elegant man with silver-rimmed glasses and a mild demeanor, greeted us with evident confusion. Monsieur Holmes? A pleasure, but I confess myself puzzled. I assure you, sir, this is not a diplomatic inquiry, Holmes replied. I merely require access to your recent outgoing parcels, those shipped via consular pouch to the Southampton route. Heck raised an eyebrow. Surely you understand, such records are confidential. Holmes gave a small smile. Then let us not waste your time. I shall simply explain the alternative that your consulate has, for the last 2 months, unknowingly transported chemical weapons disguised as sculpture to British citizens, 3 of whom are now dead. Heck went very still. Weapons? Holmes stepped closer. Yes. Silent, odorless, virtually untraceable poison cleverly delivered in innocuous bronze. You have been used, Monsieur Heck. The secretary swallowed. I had no idea. Then help me catch the one who does. Heck hesitated only a moment longer before leading us into a back office, where shipping records were kept. Holmes flipped through them with practiced speed, pulling pages at intervals and making notes. Finally, he stopped. Here. This parcel. A diplomatic crate dispatched not to a residence but to a private club, the Montmorency Circle. I blinked. A club? Holmes nodded grimly. A gentleman's club known for its secrecy. Duchamp's contact uses it as a drop point. No staff. Minimal oversight. Parcels are stored in locked cabinets until collected. He turned to Heck. Who signed for this crate? Heck examined the form. A courier named Auguste Vernet. Holmes stiffened. Vernet. You know the name? I know the name, Holmes said coldly. And now, we must trap the man behind it. Back at Baker Street, the plan formed quickly. Holmes instructed me to pose as a staff clerk from the Montmorency Circle and request a courier service to pick up a forged parcel containing another sculpture. It would be sealed with the consulate's duplicate wax emblem. Holmes had obtained one from his collection of state seals. Why the forgery? I asked. Because if the killer believes another delivery is being prepared, he will send his collector to intercept it. And this time, we'll be waiting. The trap was set by noon. The fake parcel was placed behind the reception desk at the Montmorency Circle with a clerk bribed into silence. Holmes and I took position across the street, seated in a tobacconist's shop with a clear view of the door. Hours passed. At 4 o'clock precisely, a man entered the club. He matched the composite sketch exactly: gaunt frame, high forehead, thin spectacles. He showed no identification, simply offered a handshake and a small nod to the clerk. Holmes rose. That's him. As the man exited with the parcel in hand, Holmes followed, weaving through the foot traffic until the man turned down a quiet lane toward Paddington. There, in a small alley behind a shipping depot, He stopped. Holmes stepped into the alley behind him. "Mr. Vernet, I presume?" The man turned. His face was blank, unreadable. "You're mistaken." "I never am." Holmes motioned, and two plainclothes officers appeared at the far end of the alley. Lestrade's work, following the instructions Holmes had placed in the envelope that morning. "You've been followed since dawn," Holmes said. "The statue in your hands contains nothing but the one meant for Colonel Pennington nearly killed him." Vernet's calm cracked. "You have no proof." "I have 3 dead bodies," Holmes replied coldly, "and an artisan who vanished after building your tools. I have a delivery trail, your false name, and your pattern of pickups." Vernet looked to run, but the officers closed in. "It's over," Holmes said, and it was. Back at Baker Street, as the sun finally dipped below the foggy skyline, Holmes collapsed into his chair for the first time in days. "It was never about the poison, Watson," he murmured. "It was about control. Ducharme built the device, but Vernet wielded it. Each death, each package, was timed to erase a line from a ledger of guilt, and he very nearly succeeded. I poured us both tea. And what of Ducharme? Safe in Antwerp, untouchable for now, but his shadow no longer stretches to London." Holmes stared into the fire. "We played his game," he said, "and beat him at it." The next morning, the rain came, a soft, grey curtain draping London in the hush of cleansing. Holmes sat before the fireplace, the fire burning low, his hands steepled in thought as I completed the final lines of my case notes. The air in Baker Street was strangely light, as if some invisible weight had lifted. And yet I knew, from Holmes's silence, that one last explanation remained, not for the courts, nor for the Yard, but for me. "I should very much like to hear how you untangled this," I said finally, setting down my pen. "The whole of it, from the beginning." Holmes gave a faint smile. Not of pride, but of resignation. "Very well, Watson. Let us begin not with the statues, but with a man. Alphonse Ducharme. A name buried in the margins of diplomatic archives, long forgotten save by those he wished erased." He stood and moved to the table, where the 4 confiscated statues now rested, each one identical in design, each one once a weapon. "Ducharme was a chemist," Holmes continued, "brilliant but obscure. In 1883, he discovered a method to synthesize a mercury-based compound that vaporized at relatively low heat, causing respiratory collapse without trace. At the time, his discovery was rejected by the Belgian government for ethical concerns. But certain industrial and military groups saw its potential. Among them, a small syndicate formed in Antwerp, later disguised as Société Ardent. He picked up the statuette of the raven and turned it slowly. Over the years, Ducharme's compound was smuggled in trace quantities under the guise of shipping lubricants, art preservation solutions, and fuel additives. This occurred through British ports, primarily Southampton and Dover. It required complicity, or at least negligence, from customs officers, bank clerks, and trade inspectors. Some knew, some didn't. Edwin Greaves, as you now know, discovered financial irregularities tied to these transfers and began asking questions. "And that made him the first target," I said. "Correct. He wasn't dangerous because he was loud, he was dangerous because he was cautious. If he had spoken publicly, the operation might have collapsed. Ducharme, or someone acting in his name, couldn't risk that." Holmes replaced the raven and took the cat sculpture next. But Ducharme was not in London, so he required a hand, one with mobility, precision, and trust. Enter Auguste Vernet, former courier, minor diplomat, and, more recently, professional handler. A man whose occupation was the quiet execution of logistical tasks. "Execution in the literal sense," I muttered. Indeed, Vernet used the consular pouch system to bring in pieces of Ducharme's work, chemical vials, internal housing structures, schematics without interference. He then commissioned the bronzes through Thurley, an innocent artisan. The design was specific, a beautiful object, hollow, heat reactive and timed for delivery. Holmes tapped the statue lightly. A courier would deliver the gift, always anonymous, always flattering. The recipients, all tied in some buried way to Duchamp's legacy, placed the sculpture on a shelf or a mantle, never suspecting they had brought their own death into the room. "But how did you trace Vernet?" I asked. "With so little to go on?" Holmes gestured to the wall, where a series of notes and diagrams had been pinned like a spider's web. I traced his habits, not his name. The deliveries were methodical, one every 4 to 5 days, always routed through one of 5 drop points in London, and always timed for late afternoon when postal oversight thinned. The link wasn't in the addresses, it was in the gaps between them, the silences, the pauses. Vernet was not clever because he hid. He was clever because he appeared invisible. He poured himself a cup of tea, his hands steady now. But once we intercepted a parcel, we disrupted the rhythm. I forced Vernet to adapt. And adaptation, Watson, is how one makes mistakes. "Miss Trengrove's parcel," I said. "The forged one you had placed at the Montmorency Circle." Holmes nodded. "A deliberate fabrication. I mimicked the seal, the packaging, the weight. The moment Vernet moved to retrieve it, I knew we had him. From that point, it was only a matter of containing him. And the statues themselves?" I asked. "Were they your key clue?" "No," he said. "The key clue was not in what they contained, but how they did contain it. Precision machining, variable activation thresholds, artistic craftsmanship. That required someone working from blueprints, someone who had done it before. When I realized the statues each used a slightly different activation temperature, it told me the killer was learning, improving. That meant each object was a prototype, a test." He paused, looking at the statuettes. Each victim was not just a target, they were part of an experiment. I sat back, struck by the coldness of the logic. "But to what end?" Holmes answered without hesitation. "To perfect a method. Duchamp or Vernet was preparing something larger, a delivery mechanism that could be deployed remotely, en masse, through items assumed to be harmless. It was assassination turned into engineering." "And the 4th statue?" I asked. "The one meant for Colonel Pennington?" "An improved model," Holmes said grimly. "Smaller, vile, faster activation. It would have killed within minutes of the fire being lit." There was a long silence. "At last," I said. "And Thurley?" Holmes's expression darkened. "Too late. When Vernet realized I had found the workshop, he visited it that same night. Thurley's apprentice found the door open the next morning. The tools were cold, the furnace extinguished. No sign of the man. You think he's dead? I think he is absent. Whether buried or bribed to disappear, we may never know." He turned to me then, the fatigue showing in the lines around his eyes. "We will not catch Duchamp. He is beyond our jurisdiction, protected by diplomatic webs and years of silence. But Vernet, he will answer. Scotland Yard has him now, and he has begun to speak. About? Names, lists, parcels that never reached their mark, and a ledger, an account of who was marked, who was spared, and who was yet to come." He paused, then added quietly, "Miss Trengrove was next. After her, Lady Durbridge again, then a journalist in Brighton, then a child." "A child?" Holmes nodded. "The grandchild of one of the original customs officers who exposed Duchamp in the 80s. A loose end. One, the killer, was willing to sever for no other reason than legacy." He rose and moved to the window, staring out into the damp morning light. "Duchamp and Vernet sought to erase the past by destroying the memory of their wrongdoing. But memory, Watson, is more stubborn than death. It survives in ledgers, in letters, in human conscience. We forget names, but the truth waits. And you uncovered it." "No," he said. "I interrupted it. And perhaps, for a time, that will be enough." He turned to me, and the fire behind him cast a faint halo around his figure. "This case was not a battle of deduction," he said. "It was a duel of patience. One man tested whether he could kill without being seen. I tested whether I could see without him knowing. And in the end? In the end, I looked more carefully. In the days that followed the arrest of Auguste Vernet, London braced itself for scandal, but scandal curiously did not come. Scotland Yard moved quietly. The newspapers, so often hungry for sensation, were muted, fed carefully measured statements approved by the Foreign Office. The deaths of Edwin Greaves, Lydia Farnsworth, and Elias Coburn were each formally reclassified as homicides, yet no public mention was made of the delivery method, the sculptures, or the chemical signature of their demise. It would upset the public too much, Lestrade had said bluntly. Panic over every bloody bronze ornament in the empire, people afraid to open their own post. Holmes did not argue. He merely returned to his corner chair and began clipping sections from half a dozen newspapers, arranging them in a grid across the floor. His silence in those days was of a different sort, not born of mystery, but of contemplation. Vernet, for his part, proved cooperative within limits. Under tight security at Newgate, he confessed to transporting 6 known sculptures. 4 had reached their intended targets. 1 had been intercepted. 1, Vernet claimed, had gone missing. That revelation disturbed Holmes more than anything else. 1 unaccounted for, he said to me one morning. Somewhere, someone may already have it on a mantelpiece, a sideboard, a shelf above a nursery cot, and not know they are breathing death. Despite every effort by Lestrade's men to recover it, the 6th sculpture remained lost. No manifest could trace its path. The intended recipient, if there had ever been one, was unnamed. Ducharme, still safely hidden in Antwerp under diplomatic protection, denied all involvement. No charges could be brought without extradition, and none would be granted. "This is the nature of shadows, Watson," Holmes muttered. "They retreat when struck, but they never vanish. They simply wait. But even shadows cast consequences. The Belgian consulate, though not officially blamed, quietly reassigned its secretary and courier staff. The Montmorency Circle disbanded within a fortnight, its reputation stained by implication alone. Amos Thurley's workshop remained shuttered, boarded up, its windows dark. No trace of Thurley himself ever emerged, not in Portsmouth, not on the continent, not even from the docks he once frequented. Among the survivors, Lady Helena Durbridge, Miss Julia Trengrove, Colonel Pennington, a strange kind of bond developed. They wrote to each other, Holmes later learned, sharing their experiences of narrowly escaping death, of being marked for reasons they barely understood. Pennington, especially shaken by the ordeal, resigned from all public duties and retired to a cottage in Devonshire. Miss Trengrove began work on a book, Quiet Threads, Memories of a Forgotten Bureau. She sent the first draft to Holmes for review. He read it in a single evening and returned it without comment, save for a single line written across the cover. "You remember what others chose to forget. Do not let them forget again." And what of the Yard? Lestrade, despite his usual grumbling, gained quiet recognition from his superiors for his role in the operation. He never publicly credited Holmes, though in private, he admitted it had been Holmes's idea to map Vernet's habits, Holmes's strategy to bait the pickup, and Holmes's resolve that closed the trap. But in all of this, one fact remained immutable. The killer had nearly succeeded. Holmes and I sat together one evening as the rain returned, soft and persistent against the window panes. "Have you thought?" I asked him. "What might have happened if we'd been a day slower?" Holmes nodded without looking up. Lady Durbridge would be buried, Trengrove dead, Pennington poisoned. Vernet escaped. Ducharme untouched. He picked up the cat, sculpture, and studied it again. "This is what unnerves me most, Watson. Not the method, not the silence of the deaths, but the design. Vernet didn't just kill, He curated each act. These objects were gifts. They required patience, elegance, the illusion of kindness. That is what the public will never understand. These were not attacks, they were performances. He returned the sculpture to its place and stood, walking to the window. "I watched Vernet's face when we arrested him," he said. "He wasn't afraid. He wasn't even surprised. He looked disappointed." Disappointed? Yes, as though he believed I should have let him finish, as though this were a game and I'd spoiled the ending. "And what of Ducharme?" I asked. Holmes turned, slowly. "Still in Antwerp. His network has gone to ground. The Belgian authorities have issued no indictments. He will vanish again, and we may not see his name for another decade. But we'll be watching," I said. Holmes gave a faint smile. "Yes, Watson, we will, and so will others, because this case has quietly changed the Yard's thinking. Forensics will evolve, customs will tighten, and one day, even Ducharme may find the world less willing to accommodate him." We sat in silence for a while longer. The fire had burned low, the room cast in a flickering half-light. Then, from outside, a soft knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, carrying a modest brown parcel the size of a shoebox. "This just arrived, Mr. Holmes. No return address." We both froze. Holmes took the box carefully, examined the handwriting, the wax seal, the paper quality. Then he smiled. "From Mycroft," he said. I recognized the seal. He opened it. Inside was a silver pocket watch and a note. "For timing your opponent's moves before they make them. Well played. M." Holmes chuckled softly and leaned back. And so the world turns. Later that week, he and I walked the city together through Whitehall, along the embankment, across the footbridge near Charing Cross. Holmes paused on the bridge and looked down at the Thames, murky and slow beneath us. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, "every crime leaves behind two bodies, one in the ground and one in the mind of the man who tried to stop it." He said nothing else until we returned to Baker Street. That night, I watched as he closed the ledger on the case of the invisible killer. He sealed it, bound it with twine, and placed it at the very back of his archive. "I hope," he said softly, "I never have to open it again." It was a week after the final chapter of the Vernet affair had closed that I found Holmes, one crisp April morning, in Hyde Park of all places, seated alone on a bench beneath a budding chestnut tree, a folded newspaper in his lap and no pipe in hand. The strange stillness in him caught my eye immediately. His usual restlessness, that ceaseless motion of fingers or feet, was absent. Instead, he watched the lake with such quiet intent that, for a moment, I hesitated to disturb him. "Holmes," I said, approaching cautiously, "you're out earlier than usual." He turned his head slowly, then offered me that faint, sardonic smile I had seen countless times, but today it lacked its usual sharpness. "Even the machine must rest its gears, Watson." I sat beside him, and for a few moments we simply watched the ducks skim the water, the gardeners rake the gravel, the city awaken from sleep. Then he spoke. "I received word from Lestrade this morning. Vernet hanged himself in his cell." I inhaled sharply. "Good Lord." "Late last night," Holmes continued. "No note, no visitors. He fashioned the noose from his own bed linen." "And Ducharme?" "Vanished," Holmes said flatly. "The Belgian press claims he's retired, but we know better, don't we?" I nodded. We sat in silence again, but this time it was heavier, the kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from aftermath. "He was a ghost in life, Watson," Holmes said eventually, "and now he is a ghost in death. With Vernet gone, the last living strand between us and Ducharme has been severed. You sound defeated." He shook his head. "No, but we must acknowledge that victory here is partial. We uncovered the plot, stopped the killings, saved 3 lives. But we did not catch the architect, and in that, there is a kind of unfinished chord. We returned to Baker Street shortly after 10. Holmes set about reorganizing the files. Not the major ones, but the unsolved fragments cases he had never quite closed. I watched him work in silence, observing the rare introspection that clouded his expression. By midday, he called me over. "Watson, tell me what you make of this." He handed me a slip of paper, a shipping manifest from the Portsmouth docks, dated 2 months prior to Greaves's death. One entry stood out. "Bronze antique, private commission, marked for diplomatic delivery." "What about it?" I asked. "It's not on the official consulate list." It was hand-marked by someone with diplomatic access, but it bypassed customs entirely. "Meaning, there may have been more statues," I said quietly. Holmes nodded. "Precisely. But we only found 6. He tapped the paper. "I suspect there were at least 9. 3 more unaccounted for." Vernet confirmed 6. But in his final interviews, he alluded to something else. The earlier batch. His exact words, "I thought he meant the prototypes. But now, you think they were used?" "I think 3 individuals may have died before Greaves," Holmes said. "And no one connected the dots because the mechanism was too elegant, too rare. They would have been classified as natural deaths." "Have you names?" "Not yet, but I shall." That evening, Holmes began re-examining obituaries' quiet deaths. In well-to-do homes, always in rooms alone, always sudden. He cross-referenced them with shipping records, post office ledgers, and private club directories. By midnight, he had 3. "Watson," he said, tapping the names on the page. "Margaret Ellen Shaw, died of apparent heart failure in Kensington 10 weeks before Greaves. A former school administrator in Brussels, 1879. He pointed to the second, Dr. Franklin Wells. Collapsed in his study in Chelsea. Unexplained respiratory event. Once advised Parliament on trade policy with Belgium. And the third, Holmes, lingered there. Archibald Gresham, a retired painter, found dead in his studio. One of his clients, Thurley the bronzes smith. The link, Watson. The earliest link. He circled the names, then leaned back. "Now we know," he said softly. 9 intended victims. 6 packages confirmed. 3 dead before we ever began. I stared at the paper. "Will you tell the Yard?" "No," he said. "Not yet. It's conjecture without physical evidence, but I'll archive the data. One day, when someone asks why these people died, the truth will wait for them." In the days that followed, Holmes returned to routine life with slow purpose. Clients came and went. The newspapers returned to more palatable topics. Yet beneath it all, the air around 221B felt subtly altered. A case like this did not fade. It clung. One evening, weeks after the affair had concluded, Holmes received a curious parcel this time from Belgium. It contained nothing but a photograph, a coastal town. Empty street, a lone man walking away from the camera. His face turned. Holmes stared at it for a long time. "Ducharme?" I asked. He nodded. "Or someone who wants us to think it is. Why send it? A warning, perhaps, or an invitation. Some men cannot help themselves. Even as they flee, they reach backward for acknowledgement." He burned the photograph in the fireplace. And yet, despite the unfinished quality of the case, Holmes seemed content in his way. "You see, Watson," he said one night as we walked the embankment, "truth is not a weapon. It is a light. Sometimes it blinds. Sometimes it illuminates. But it always alters the shape of the room." He turned toward the river. "Vernet is gone. Ducharme is silent. But those statues no longer sit quietly in homes. They sit in evidence vaults, watched and understood. That, I believe, is enough." I placed my hand on his shoulder. "It was never about fame for you, was it?" He smiled faintly. "No, Watson. It was about preventing silence." We returned home beneath a sky cleared of cloud, the stars faint but present above the rooftops. Back in Baker Street, Holmes sat once more in his chair and opened a new case book. On the title page, he wrote, "The Case of the Invisible Killer, a study in precision, patience, and the fragility of forgotten things." And underneath, in small, neat script, "He killed with silence." I answered with sound. Spring had fully broken over London by the time the final traces of the case had settled. The air was cleaner, the sky less grey, and the city, despite its persistent chaos, had resumed its familiar rhythms. But within 221B Baker Street, something had shifted. The furniture sat in the same places, the books remained in their piles, and the smell of tobacco still lingered faintly in the walls. But Holmes himself was altered, not in form, but in depth. The case had left its impression on him as surely as a thumb leaves its mark in wax. He spent the following fortnight in quiet contemplation, polishing monographs, revisiting old chemical experiments, and keeping correspondence with certain foreign agents under assumed names. I noticed that he paused more often while reading now, as though his mind wandered to spaces even he could not map. Then, one morning, he laid a small envelope upon my desk with nothing more than the word "Conclusion." Inside was a handwritten letter not addressed to me, nor Lestrade, nor any living soul, but rather to the memory of the victims. To those silenced by refinement rather than rage, I offer this record not for justice rendered, but for truth remembered. In the quietest of crimes lie the greatest of intentions, and those who kill without touch must be pursued not with might, but with mind. The invisible killer has a name. Auguste Vernet, executor of a legacy he did not begin, yet wore proudly as his own. It is the name of every man and woman who served, unknowingly, in a system designed to erase them the moment they noticed too much. I did not catch the architect, but I shattered the foundation he trusted, and for now, that must be enough. Below the final line, Holmes had signed it simply, S.H. I folded the letter and returned it to its envelope with reverence. This was Holmes at his most personal, a man who rarely allowed emotion to eclipse precision. That he had written these words, not for publication, but for posterity, told me just how deeply this case had reached into him. That same afternoon, we were summoned to New Scotland Yard, where Lestrade wished to show us the final inventory. In the evidence room, locked in reinforced glass cases, were the remaining sculptures, objects that had once been silent engines of death. Now they sat inert, labeled, documented, and harmless. Their gleaming surfaces, once polished to entice admiration, now seemed almost mocking in their stillness. "They'll be studied for years," Lestrade said. "Training manuals, security policies, the lot. You've changed how we look at domestic threat. The Yard owes you." Holmes shook his head. "You owe those who didn't live to see their stories told." As we departed the Yard, I asked him the question I'd held for weeks. Will Ducharme ever answer for this? Holmes didn't answer at first. He adjusted his coat and stared up at the sky as if consulting something larger than evidence or reason. "One day," he said, "men like Ducharme don't vanish. They mutate, they wait, but they leave traces, and if he acts again, even with a different face, I shall know it. And if he never does, then we remember." Holmes said, "We remember the victims, the clues, the shape of the crime, and we prepare for the next man who thinks himself invisible." I wrote to Miss Trengrove shortly after, and she replied with a small card of thanks. Lady Durbridge sent Holmes a bottle of rare Italian vermouth, which he tucked away without comment. Colonel Pennington never wrote again. Weeks passed, and spring deepened into early summer. The statues remained behind glass. Thurley was never found, and Ducharme's name faded once more into diplomatic whispers and backroom reports. One warm June evening, I returned home late and found Holmes seated at the table, a letter in one hand and a pressed flower in the other. "The sick statue," he said. "What about it?" "It has turned up in Florence. A British collector purchased it from a private dealer, completely unaware. Customs flagged it when the courier declared the item as sealed bronze with temperature cavity. It matched our schematics. Was it armed? No. Empty. Perhaps discarded before it could be completed, or perhaps meant as a spare." He folded the letter and slid it into the fire. "That's all of them then," I said. He nodded slowly. 9 made. 9 accounted for. The circle closes. That night, as we sat with a glass of wine between us, Holmes offered something rare, an unguarded reflection. "You know, Watson, this case was not won through brilliance." "I beg to differ," I replied. "No," he said gently. "It was won through attention, to detail, to silence, to the invisible marks others would overlook. Had we blinked, once dismissed a scent, ignored a ledger, declined a second visit, he would have succeeded. Entirely. But we didn't," I said. "No," he said, eyes distant. "We didn't." Then he stood, crossed to the cabinet, and drew out a locked ledger, the one he used only for the most unusual cases. He opened it, wrote a single line, and closed it again. I glanced at the spine. There was no title. IX, and beneath it, one word: vapor. Later that year, the Royal Society published an anonymous article titled "The Dangers of Concealed Compounds in Decorative Materials." It made no mention of Holmes, of course. But I recognized the cadence, the precision, the knowledge. His quiet legacy would ripple outward into science, into justice, into the unknowing lives of those who would never learn how close they came to death. And as always, Holmes asked for no credit. Only, perhaps, the satisfaction of having noticed what no one else had.